This is a non-live recording of Lamed Amud Beis and Brachot for Amud Yomi, starting out on Lamed Amud Aleph at the bottom by the Mishnah. Blessed ben Azariah Omer, Ein Tfilas HaMusafin Ela B'Cheve'ir. Blessed ben Azariah says that you don't daven Musaf unless you have Chever ear. As Rashi explains, that means that the tefillah of Musaf was not metaken except with regarding to having a tzibur there. Lo tiknu el b'tzibur chaveir chaburas ir. V'chachamim ayrim b'chaveir v'shlei b'chaveir. The Chachamim say, as we paskin, that you daven musaf whether you have a tzibur or you're davening b'yechidus. Rabbi Yehuda Aimer Mishmai. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name, as Rashi says, over Blessed ben Azariah, Makim she'eshem chaver ir, wherever you have a tzibur, yachid pater mitfilas hamusafin. A yachid is pater from musaf. So what does this mean? So the Gemara asks, Rabbi Yehuda had a Tanakama. It sounds like each of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi ben Azariah and the Tanakama in the name of Rabbi ben Azariah are suggesting that a person's obligation to daven musaf is dependent on the tzibur. So what does that mean practically? Is there a difference between the two opinions of Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama in Rabbi ben Azariah? Answers the Gemara, yes, there's a difference. There's a difference between the two opinions as it relates to a yachid when he is not davening with a tzibur. Tanakama savar pater. The Tanakama holds that he's pater. Rabbi Yehuda savar chayiv. In other words, according to the Tanakama, a yachid is pater to daven musaf. When does the yachid become chayiv to daven musaf? When there's a tzibur. Whereas according to Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi ben Azariah, Yachid is chayav daven musaf. When does Yachid become pater? Only when there is a tzibur. Says Rashi, Yachid shlei b'chever ir. We're talking about a situation of a Yachid where there's no tzibur. Yachid adar be'ir she'ein sham asara. It's a Yachid who's living in a town that don't have a minyan, right? Why do you don't have a minyan? Because they don't have simply 10 people. Because if they did, of course, we would be davening with a minyan. So l'tana kamali with Rabbi ben Azariah to kamali tiknu basara. Yachid zeh pater. According to the Tanakam and Rabbi ben Azariah, the only time a person is chayiv to daven musaf is when there's chaver. If there's no chaver, he's pater. Well, Rabbi Yehuda, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, name of Rabbi ben Azariah, ein yachid pater elam makom asara. The yachid is not going to be pater, rather he's going to be chayiv. The only time the yachid is pater is when there's a tzibur, sheshir tzibur pater, because the shech tzibur is going to be the one who is going to be patering him. So we do find a difference, a distinction between the Tanakama in Rabbi ben Azariah and the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi ben Azariah. We pass, and of course, however, like the Chacham, as we will continue on seeing further on. It says the Gemara. So we are now a few lines up from the bottom. Amar Rav Huna bar Chinana. So Amar Rav Huna bar Chinana, Amar Rav Chia bar Rav. Halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda she'amar mishum Rabbi ben Azariah. So first we open up with Rav Huda bar Chinana, who says, in the name of Rabbi Chia, the son of Rab, that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, who said the name of Rabbi ben Azariah. That is to say that a yachid will be chayev so long as there's no minyan, and if there's a minyan, that'll be pater because the shech tzibur is going to be patering. Amalei Rabbi Chia bar Avin, shaper ka'amris. What this Rabbi Huda bar Chinana is saying seems to be correct. To Omar Shmuel, because we know that Shmuel said, "Miyomar lematzilin susim l'musafin." Miyach, as Shmuel said about himself, as we turn the page to Laman of Beis, that I never daven musaf b'yechidas. I never daven musaf on my own bin nerda. In nerda, I never daven musaf on my own. Why? Because he was always pater from musaf because it was a chever ear. So that is to say, Shmuel was not davening with the min; he's standing alone. But there is a min, there is a chever ear, there is a tzibur that's patering. So Shmuel said that I never daven musaf. Why? As Rashi says, "L'fishiyeshim tzibur v'ashech patrani," because there's a shech tzibur, there's a tzibur davening, and the shech tzibur is pater, so I don't have to daven musaf. However, levar me yom b'da'asapum, so the malkal and masa v'atrid rabbanim v'leitzalu. There was a day when the army came to town in Erda, and it made everybody crazy, made everybody nervous, and so they ended up not having a minyan, not davening with a minyan, so there was no shech tzibur. So it's solidly biyachid, and therefore I davened on my own. I daven privately because there was not a Sibur meeting. There was nobody to be pattering me. So who's that? That's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Rabbi ben Azariah. Because according to the Tanna Kama, the name of Rabbi ben Azariah, then the fact that there was no Chaver Ir that day, the fact that there was no minion, so it should have pattered him. It's obviously not the Chachamim, because the Chachamim say you have to daven even if it's not Chaver Ir. So Shmuel's clearly not going to Chachamim, so they left only one option. Only Rabbi Huda, never Blazer ben Azariah, who says that if there's Chaver Ir, then you'll be pattered. If there's no Chaver Ir, then you're Chaver. And that's exactly what happened here in the case of Shmuel. Continues the Gemara, and the Gemara says, the totally be Yachid, but have Yachid Shlem b'Chaver, and that's exactly the situation of Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Blazer ben Azariah. Yosef Rabbi Chinan Akara. So Rabbi Chinan Akara was sitting Kamed Rabbi Yanai. So he was sitting in front of Rabbi Yanai, v'Yosef Kamar, and what did he say? Allah Rabbi Yehuda Shem Shem Blazer ben Azariah. He said also that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Rabbi Blazer ben Azariah. Now, here we could spend a minute just to mention who Rabbi Chinan Akara was. Rabbi Chinan Akara is called Kara because of the fact that he was an expert in the Bible. Right? There are people who are Bali Mikra, Bali Mishnah, right? Bali Agada, Bali Talmud. Look in the Gemara Chagiga Yudalit for a list of these kinds of people. However, interestingly, here Rabbi Chanina Kara, who is a Bible teacher, who's expert in the Bible, he's trying to say over halacha. Halacha would seem to be in accord with what we have just seen from Reb Huna bar Chanina, from Rav Chia bar Avin, from Shmuel. So he's simply saying over the chatter that everybody else says, which is we pass like with the name of Blazer ben Azariah. So he tries that in front of Rabbi Yanai. And what did Rabbi Yanai say? Go read your psukim outside. In other words, a pretty uh, acerbic line. Go read your psukim outside. Go focus on your chumash. Then halacha Rabbi Yehuda Shem Shem Rabbi ben Azariah. The halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda that says the name of Rabbi ben Azariah. Now, interestingly, if you look in the Gemara Yavamas Mem or the Mark Subas Nun Vav, you see over there where Rabbi Chanina Kara is also saying halachas, and Rabbi Yanai is disagreeing with him, and he's saying you gotta leave, go read your psukim outside, because you're a big expert in Tanakh, but that's where your focus should be, because you're making a mistake. So you have these three places. Rabbi Chanina Kara is trying to say over halacha, and Rabbi Yanai is disagreeing with him, and saying go outside and go focus on your chumash. Clearly, he didn't get the hint after once or twice or three times, and he was nevertheless, despite sort of being acerbically acerbically pushed out of the base madrash, go focus on your psukim, and maybe not honorably named by saying that he was a master of chumash, and not saying that he was, just from Chanina. Well, maybe we have to distinguish him from another Chanina, but saying Chanina Kara might not necessarily be the most prestigious kind of a nickname, especially if you go with Rashi that we have back in Chav Ches, that a person is not supposed to be teaching his keeping his son mana the benai from Higayon from too much, according to the way Rashi learned, from too much study of Tanakh. So because it's mashra draws you in, so you have the person. This is his whole life. That's how he's termed. Not necessarily the most honorable of nicknames. And nevertheless, he's still trying to clearly be involved and engaged in the halachic debate. Okay, continues the Gemara that the Gemara says that Rabbi Chanina Kara attempted to get Rabbi Yanai to agree that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Rabbi Blazer ben Azariah, and he disagreed. He said, "Go outside, go study your psukim outside, because the halacha is not, decidedly not, like Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Rabbi Blazer ben Azariah." So let's just finish the word before we go to Taisvis. So I'm Rabbi Yechanan. So now we have another story. Rabbi Yechanan says, "Ani Ra'isias Rabbi Yanai." So in other words, we just had the Rabbi Yanai said that the halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Rabbi Blazer ben Azariah. So that gives us two options of who the halacha could be like. The halacha could be like either the Tanakh, the name of Rabbi Blazer ben Azariah, or the halacha could be like the Chachamim. So now Rabbi Yochanan says, "Ani re'isias Rabbi Yanai." Rabbi Yochanan says, "I saw Rabbi Yanai did tzoli b'hader tzoli." He davened, and then he davened again. Now, what does that mean? For Rabbi Yochanan, this is a proof that if he davened, then he davened again. V'lo base tefillah, says Rashi. Al achas al shachas, shachas al musaf, and one was obviously shachas and one was musaf. So Shema Mina left side Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So you see, it doesn't hold Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah at all. That is to say, Rabbi Yochanan is seeing Rabbi Yanai davening, and then he davened again. He davened two Shemona Esreis. So Rabbi Yochanan is extrapolating from here that the halacha must be like the Chachamim. How do we understand that? Why do we say that? So um, so the Gemara is telling you that only the Rabbi Yochanan saw Rabbi Yanai daven once and then daven a second time. We don't get more information. So I'm like Rabbi Yirmiyah to Rabbi Zera. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zera, "The Dilma meikar loikiven daite." Why is Rabbi Yochanan making an assumption here that the halacha is like the Chachamim? Maybe Rabbi Yanai simply didn't have kavanah, so he had to daven again. So the Gemara answers, Amalei, Rabbi Zera said to Rabbi Yirmiyah, Chaziman gava rabba the kamasad aleh. See who the great person is who's telling us this story. That is to say, Rabbi Yochanan is telling us this story. Rabbi Yochanan is medactic well. If his story is going to have a halachic relevance and a halachic resonance, Rabbi Yochanan is going to be medactic well. If it was simply a situation where he didn't have kavana and so he had to daven again, then Rabbi Yochanan wouldn't have said over this as a story. There would be nothing to learn out of this story. It reminds us of a Gemara earlier on your Dalan and Beis, where the Gemara told us a story there about Rav, a testimony about Rav. That Rav, one time, what he did was he was Neitel Yanav, he was Meniach Tfilin, he was Kari Kriyashma, and he was Mispalal. And there was another time where Rav didn't do that, and what Rav did was sometimes he would wash his hands. He would make the bracha b'rasat Torah. He would then put on tefillin, and then he would say Shema. So, so the question was about Rav, why sometimes he ended up saying the Shema. Rav Mashi Yodav V'Kar Kriya Shema V'Anach Tefillin, that sometimes he washed his hands, recited the Shema, then put on tefillin, and then he davened. And so the Gemara said, well, maybe at those times, maybe it wasn't the Zman of Kriya Shema. Maybe it wasn't the time of Kriya Shema. So the Gemara says, Imke Maya Hasadusa de Rav Chim Barashi. Then what will be the testimony of Rav Chim Barashi if the reason that Rav was being spoken about, that he had davened, he had said the Shema before he put on tefillin, right, which we had already learned, like sort of a made sheger ba'atzim, right, a person is supposed to be wearing the tefillin, it says Shema, if the reason was because it wasn't yet the right time, right, if Rav would sometimes say the Shema later, earlier, depending on whether or not the Zman had reached the proper time to say Shema, then there will be no point to the story. The whole point of the story is that it was already Zman Kriya Shema, and Rav said the Shema without putting on tefillin, or put on the tefillin and then said Shema. That's why the story becomes relevant. And the same thing over here. If Rabbi Yochanan is telling us a story that Rabbi Yanai davened two Shemona Esreis, it's obviously not because he didn't have kavanah in one and then decided to daven again. We're going to see in a minute that he's going to be able to have a kavanah in the next one, so he tried again. There will be no halachic relevance to the story. It will be like anybody else who's forgotten to have kavanah, and he's going to want to try again to have kavanah in his next davening. So now, clearly that's not an option. So what then is the story? He was davening shachas and then he davened musaf. We know that Rabbi Yanai says that the halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So that takes away one of the three options. But we still have two options. We still have the option of the Chachamim, and we have the option of the Tanna Kamma believes Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Now, obviously, we're talking about a situation where Rabbi Yochanan was watching Rabbi Yanai daven b'yechidus, right? Because if he was davening in public, if he was davening with a tzibur, and he saw that he davened Shemona Esrei, he davened Musaf, so then for sure he holds like the Chachamim. Why is for sure hold like the Chachamim? because according to the Tanakhama, Libud Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, as the Gemara already pointed out, in a tzibur, that's what he holds is the I'm sorry, he holds that in a tzibur, the only time that you have a chiyuv is in a tzibur. So if it will be a situation, I apologize, I said that not 100%. If it will be a situation where he was in the tzibur and he saw that he would be davening twice, there will be no raya. Because according to the Tanakh Kabbalah of Rabbi Lezer, you're always potter until you have a tzibur. When you have a tzibur, that's when you're chayiv. And according to Chacham, you're always chayiv. So if you saw him davening with a tzibur, there will be no proof as to whether he was going with the Chachamim or the Tanakh Kabbalah of Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah. However, it must be davening b'yechidus. So you saw they daven twice, and the second davening is from Musaf. In that case, it must not be going like the Tanakh Kabbalah of Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, because they hold that b'yechidus or yachid shaloi b'chever ir is not mechuyev. That's what we just saw in the Gemara in Lamed Amud Aleph. That a yachid shaloi b'chever ir Tanakh Kabbalah savar pater. So then it must be that a yachid where he davened twice, that it has to be going like the Chacham, because they say that a person is chuyev is daven musaf whether it's b'chever ir or shaloi b'chever ir. So it comes out beautiful how we know that Rabbi Yochanan is telling us that the halacha is in fact like the Chacham. Let's just do a couple more lines before we go back to Taisves. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Ami v'Rabbi Asi, Afagav dahavu l'kleisa be'knishta b'Tveria, even though they had, so many shuls to pick from in Tveria, nevertheless, lo have a matzah ela b'nei amudei hechad avigarsi. Right, the Gemara already explained before on Ches that there was a special benefit to davening where you learn, and so the Gemara is bringing down the Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi would daven where they learned, and not go to the Beis Knesses. Again, the Gemara on Ches told us that Abaye said Mereish Yispal Beis Knesses. Initially, he would daven in the shul of Elam and Abaye, and he would learn at home. But once he heard that Ein LaKadosh Baruch Hu Adad Ramashal Lacha Bovad, so then Matzilda Rakim Bakim the Garisna. Then he says, I'm going to daven only the place where I learn. And there we see, and then the Gemara brings down the Ma'aser of Amir Rabasi that they would do the same. That is to say, what in the world does this have to do with Musaf? So presumably, we are just telling you either a random story, or we have to find the connection to Musaf. Says, look at Taisus now. Taisus says, Ein halacha k'Rabbi Yehuda she'am Shem Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. We know that Rabbi Yanai said that halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. El halacha k'Rabbanan. Rather, halacha is like the Rabbanan. V'chein pasuk Rabbeinu Chananel. And so to Rabbeinu Chananel's paskening that the halacha is like the Rabbanan, that a person is mechuyev dal musaf whether it's b'chever ir or shaloi b'chever ir. The lahachi ma'isi says Taisus. That's why we're bringing down Rabbi Ami Rabasi. That's why we're bringing down Rabbi Ami Rabasi, that they used to daven bein amudei, but they daven where they learned. Ma'asid Rabbi Rabasi you heard him spell yachid kirabanan bein amudei de garis. They would daven the garsi. They would daven biyechidus like the Rabbanan say, right where they learned. Lashmina the halacha kirabanan, to teach you that the halacha is like the Rabbanan. Again, it's not 100% clear to me that from here that we're talking about Musaf. I still have no idea. It could be that they daven where they learn, and we're talking about davening Shachris. Where do we know that they also daven Musaf? Maybe they did not daven. Maybe they did not daven anything other than Shachris. Maybe they relied on the fact that there was Chaver Ir, all the shuls in Tveria. It's not 100% clear to me. That how Taisus knew this. Okay. Be it as it may, we paskin. The Rebbeinu Chananel says, Taisus says, we for sure paskin like the Rabbanan, and that would for sure be the proof from the story of Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai davening b'yechidus that Rabbi Yochanan was talking about could only work then according to the Rabbanan. So therefore, we would go against what we said over the name of Rav Huna bar Chinana, the name of Chia Barav, who felt that you do daven musaf only when there's a yechidus, because when there's a tzibur you be pater. Like Rabbi Huda, the name of Elazar ben Azariah, we do not go with those people. We do not go with Kara, etc. Continues the Gemara. Itmar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdimi, Mishum Rabbeinu. Again, Mishum Rabbeinu, as I mentioned before, Rashi here explains that's the name of Rav. We're going to see it in other places throughout brachas. Sometimes Rashi explains, sometimes Rashi doesn't explain. Nevertheless, that is for now, for our purposes now. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdimi says the name of Rav. Halach Rabbi Yehuda Shalom Mishum Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So we have another opinion that says that halach is like Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Nevertheless, as we say, Rabbi Chananel and others do not go with this. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba tzoli v'haret tzoli. Another story. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba davened and then he davened again. So we don't know exactly why he was doing this. So Amar Rabbi Zera, my time ovid mar hachi. So Rabbi Zera asked Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, why is it that you davened and then you're davening again? When Rabbi Yanai did it, Rabbi Yochanan said it over. We were able to prove that it was a situation of a Yachan who was davening Shachar and Musaf, and therefore it looks like the Chachamim. So over here, Rabbi Zera is asking Rabbi Rabba, why did you daven a second time? Ilema mishum like even mardaite. If it's because you didn't have a sufficient amount of kavana, and so you wanted to daven again. A person should always judge about themselves. If he's able to have kavana, he should daven lav al yispal. And if he doesn't have enough, if he's not able to have kavana, then he shouldn't daven. So it doesn't want to make the assumption that the Rebbe Chiya bar Abba was unable to have kavana in the first Shemona Esrei, and therefore decided to have a second go at it. Because a person's supposed to judge about himself. Are you able to have kavana right now? If you can't have kavana right now, then wait until you're able to have some kavana. So of course he wouldn't be chayshish. He's telling Rebbe Chiya bar Abba that you would have davened a second Shemona Esrei because you didn't have kavana in your first. Obviously, you would have only davened your first when you were ready to have kavana. So that's not the issue. So why did you daven two times right away? So says the Gemara, El Dlei Itkar Mar the Reish Yarcha must have been Rosh Chodesh that day, and he's saying to Rabbi Abba, you must have forgotten to say Yal V'Yaveh, so therefore you are saying Shemona Esrei again. But he asks in Vatanya, but didn't we learn in a Brayso? Tov Lehiskish Rosh Chodesh Ba'arves. Didn't we learn that if somebody forgets to say Al V'Yaveh at night, you don't make him go back and say it again, the Shemona Esrei. Why? Because you're able to say over the Yal V'Yaveh by Shachas. B'Shachas ein machzir nesin le'shiachal amar b'musafan. By Shachas, you're able to say over effectively by Musaf, even though there's no Yal V'Yaveh by Musaf. Right, the whole Shemona Esrei is for Rosh Chodesh, so you don't have a specific aspect that is Musaf. But nevertheless, since the whole thing is dedicated to Rosh Chodesh, it's by definition like mentioning Yal V'Yaveh. So and if you forget by Musaf, then you don't have to go back because you can mention it again by Mincha. Obviously, we do not paskin like this, Brisa, but nevertheless, it's edifying because Rav Zera is asking Chibar Abba, they saw they davened twice. And he said it can't be because he didn't have Kavana, because he wouldn't have davened Kavana, he wouldn't have davened without Kavana in the first place. So it must be he had Kavana. And why is he davening second time? It's not Musaf. In this situation, he's assuming it was a second Shemona Esrei of Shachris, and he's asking him, why are you davening second Shemona Esrei of Shachris? Don't you agree that if a person forgot Yal V'Yaveh, that they don't have to go back, that they can simply rely on the next tefillah of the day on Rosh Chodesh to take them through? So the Gemara says, no. Says the Gemara, Amalei Lav Idmar Lav Chibar Abba responded to him, didn't we say on this idea that you don't go back because you can rely on another tefillah? This whole halacha is only applicable by the tzibor. By the tzibor meaning, this is not 100% clear what we mean when we say the tzibor, but maybe it means the shliach tzibor, maybe it's in the middle of a tzibor, but whatever it means, what we are attempting to say is that the only time that a person wouldn't have to go back, that they can rely on another tefillah, etc., that's when somebody's davening with tzibor. But if somebody's davening yechilas, then they would have to go back. And therefore, if that's the case, says Rebbe Chiya bar Abba, now you understand why I had to go back. I forgot, so therefore I had to go back and do it again. But it's not a proof here, anything to do with Musa. It says Rashi, what does it mean with Tzibur Shanu? That we're talking here about a situation with Tzibur. That he doesn't have to go back because he's going to hear it over from the Shliach Tzibor. V'ika mixas haskara, right? And that's going to be, in a sense, almost like he's saying it. But if he was alone, he would have to go back. So that's one way of understanding Mitzvah Shonu. Bahag Mafar says Rashi that the Bahag writes, what does it mean Mitzvah Shonu? It's Bishat. It's not talking about a person who's davening with a minion. Rather, Shliach Tzibur himself doesn't have to go back. B'Shem Tirchen Tzibura. But a Yochan has to go back even if he's in a minion. And this is, of course, how we paskin that if you're a Shliach Tzibur, so then you don't go back because you're being, being matriach the tzibur. But if you're a yachid who forgot, if you're davening alone, you have to go back. If you're davening with a tzibur, then we pass like the bahag that you do have to go back. But there is an opinion that would have said that no, if you're davening a tzibur, you wouldn't have to go back. But either way, what this now explains to Rav Zer, who's asking Rav Chi Barabba why he davened the second time wasn't because he lacked kavanah the first time, rather because he had just forgotten the Rosh Chodesh, and obviously he was davening in a situation either according to the Bahagi he was davening alone. I'm sorry, either according to the first shot of Rashi he was davening even in a tzibur or alone, or according to the Bahagi he was davening alone, and therefore, I'm sorry. According to Rashi, if he was davening with the tzibur, then he would be part because he could rely on the tzibur. So this would be a situation where he's obviously davening alone. According to the Bahag, where you daven with the tzibur, you still have to go over it. So then it could be even talking about a situation of a tzibur where you have to daven a second time. Okay. So the Gemara wants to know, before we get to the Gemara, we have a few Taisus in. So Taisus says, V'atanya Tov lo hiskash rosh chodesh ba'arvis ein machzirin oisei. So we don't have this gear, so like garcinin lay to amina v'samach tov lo hiskash rosh chodesh ein machzirin oisei l'fi she'em mekachin. Says doesn't want to put that part of the girsa inside the Gemara. The Gemara had said that ba'arvis ein machzirin oisei v'nei shiachol omer b'shachar. Says that's we don't want to have that girsa because we're going to say in a minute the reason you don't say it over by shachar is because I'm sorry. The reason you don't have to repeat over Yal Shemona Esrei when you forgot Yal V'Yovei night is because of the fact that we said that you're not Makash the Chodesh at night. So a different reason. So maybe we should take out the Girsa. And that is the what do you call? The Girsa of the Bach as well. Kama Yisha Ben Tefillah Tefillah. How much should a person wait between the two tefillahs, which is the next Gemara over here. Okay, so the Gemara says, Kama Yisha Ben Tefillah Tefillah. How much does a person wait between their davenings? In other words, if somebody's davening another davening, whether it's they're davening a Musaf, as Rashi says, it could be that they're, going to daven something else. How much do they have to wait in between the two tefillahs? So the Gemara says, right, because you have to be able to get to a place where you can have kavanah again. So the Gemara says, Chanina, Chad Amar Kadesh Tchainin, Shetischainin Daitelov, Chadam Kadesh Shetischailel Daitelov. So Rashi says they're both the same idea, but it's basically getting the ability to have presence again, have the calmness again to be Masada your tefillah. The one who holds that it's based upon the tischainin of the das to make somebody have a daita to be musheves and calm to be able to focus. Where did he get the lashon of tischainin? V'eschanan al Hashem. Umad Amar Kadesh Tischailo Daitilo, and the one who says that has to be the das has to be Tischailo. Dosiv Vayachal Moshe. Right, so there you see Vayachal as the same sort of idea. Moshe was davening to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Amar Rav Anan, Amar Rav. So Rav Anan says the name of Rav Tov Yizkish Chodesh Arvis. Somebody made a mistake and did not say over Yal V'Yaveh at night. So what's the halacha? In Machzirin, so you don't make him go back and say Shemona Esrei again. The fish ain't based in Mekadosh Nesachedesh Alabayim because they were not Mekadosh Nesachedesh except by the day. Amar Meimar Mistaver Milsa de Rav B'Chedesh Molei. Shalmeimer says maybe Rav says makes sense in a month, which is a Chedesh Molei, because you can have the second night, which is the main night, and then you could say Yal V'Yaveh Yal B'Chedesh Chaser, but on a day when you only have one day Rosh Chodesh. And therefore, that's the only day. That's the main day. Then you should have to go back. Only Rav Ashi Lamim. Rav Ashi disagrees, and he says to Mechdi, Rav Taimakam. Rav gave his reason. The reason was because you're not Mekadosh Chodesh at night. Mali Chaser, Mali Mali. What's the difference if it's a Chaser or a Mali type of a month? Eloishnu, there's no difference. Fine. Now let's have to do a few Taisus. So Taisa says If a person is tov ratzilis bal shenes, a person who's made a mistake and wants to daven now a second time, v'chein bein tefillah shachas or tefillah musaf, so too it also applies between shachas and musaf. And I think bisman hazeh, the way we daven mincha ma'ariv before and after shkia, it also applies to us. What is the amount of time that a person has to wait between the daven and two shemona esrei? I would say it's not necessarily the shemona esrei per se; it's the next tefillah that you're going to daven. Ma'ariv, you have a few things that you say beforehand. But what is the amount of time? So the Gemara said, "Kadei shetischayin or tischel daitelav." So Taisus brings down the next Taisus. The Yerushalmi says, "Dahainu ke sheyelech arba amas." That's when a person is traveling 4 amas, meaning a couple of seconds. That's a sufficient amount of time to make a separation to be able to have people to get their das back. The reason that the Rav gave for why you do not have to go back at night was because we're not mekadosh lechedesh at night. It says Taisus, "Levish ein mekadosh lechedesh perish le'el b'reish perik in mashem action." Right? We learned earlier on Chavav this idea about not having to go back. But typically it says Taisus Shem Rishus. Maybe we want to say that the reason that person doesn't have to go back to say the Yalvi in Ma'ariv is because Tfilas Ma'ariv is a Rishus. So Taisus explains, Mishum Lahainu Dafka Lasses Mitzvah Acheres Severes. Remember, Taisus had answered already that Ma'ariv is not a Rishus. It's a mitzvah, even though the Gemara used the term Rishus, Taisus feels that it's a mitzvah, and the mitzvah is a one that is going to stand down if you have another mitzvah verse that it has to take precedence. So, um, so you can't use that as a reason to say that, oh, you don't have to go back and say Marav again because Marav is a Rishos. Marav is not a Rishos. Marav is a Chiyuv. It's just, it stands down whenever there's a contour or another Chiyuv that's going to trump it. It continues the Taisus. Yesh version de la dafka b'layla mishana ein machzirun es lefishem mekash nechadesh b'layla. Avlayla shni machzirun es shekvar mekudesh miyom shelafana v'lein ner l'chalek. So Taisus says, well, the Gemara essentially wanted to say maybe that there's a difference between the first and the second night. And Taisus ends up saying, no, there's no difference between the first and the second night. Don't make a chilek. And the Gemara concludes, Mistaver Milsa the Rav v'chedesh malei, that a Maimer wanted to suggest that maybe this only applies by a chedesh malei, not by a chedesh chaser. And we end up rejecting that Mali Chas and Mali Mala, and so it doesn't make any difference. Taisus says in the Taisus of Mistaver, the last Taisus in the fourth parak, the Taisus says, Kloimer Shahaya Isil Shalafan of Male, in the month where there was 2 days of Shchedesh, Az Yachal Emra Arash Shamach, and then you're able to say it for tomorrow, Shehu Iker. And since that's the main day, the second day of Rosh Chodesh, so then that night you have to go back. But the first night is not the main day; it's really the Lamed day of the previous month. So if you don't have to go back, so Taish says, whenever the Chacham said that you don't have to go back on something, going down v'yavai ba'arvis, ba'alanisim or alanisim, loy meboya im akar raglav v'pasach mebracha shalachmet. It doesn't make a difference if a person already took 3 steps back or not. The aim machzirunase alafil loyakar el shasiyim myself bracha shatiglim ba la'imra aim machzirunase. Even if a person just finished the bracha that is relevant, they don't have to already go back. V'loy nehira v'min achlan disagrees. So Ibn Achan disagrees with that, and he brings down a whole series of potential reasons for that. But skipping towards the end of Taisves, Taisus says, "Umiu ein raya mehasam." The shiny hasam berachas hamazon shekvar berach gimel brachas. You can't bring any raya berachas hamazon because the berachas hamazon after the first brachas is not the rabbanon. Berachas teva meitev after raisi. The first 2 brachas maybe, but after that it's not the raiso. Came ein machzirun esel again. But if you don't make the person go back, ein daimasham. Hefsek kol kaf ein lahavira liyurchas brachas and yachziru b'davar she'ein leilachzar havik me'afsaka. If you make somebody go back to things that they weren't otherwise supposed to be going back to, that could be considered potentially a hefsek. Taisus concludes, and the last line of this Taisus is Umiu Eimeri de Ra es Rabbeinu Tam dehechad le'akar raglav chazal ritzei. Whenever Rabbeinu Tam had not yet taken 3 steps back, he would go back to ritzei if he forgot Yal v'Yavai or Al Hanisim, he would go back, and so long as he hadn't taken his 3 steps back. I feel b'dvarim she'ein machzirin kegon Al Hanisim v'chein ima hadavar. He would go back even on things that you don't have to go back for, like Al Hanisim. He would still go back, and the halacha is with him. Hadrolach Tfilas hashachar hadlok tfilas hashachar hadlok alok tfilas hashachar. Next mission. Ein omdim l'spal amiter kevid rosh. A person is only allowed to daven when he has sufficient amount of kevid rosh. He has sufficient amount of fear of the Rebbeinu Shalom, a certain amount of presence of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Chasidim Rishonim Rishon Sha'achas Spal K'nei Shechavim Lahem Avdim Shema Shemayim. The early Chasidim, they used to wait for an hour and daven in order to be able to reach the requisite level of kavanah. They had sort of a meditation or something. Later on, I think we're going to see that not just they waited an hour, but they actually waited three. It was a 3 hour process of davening because it was an hour before, an hour to daven, an hour after davening to cool down. They did that 3 times a day. That's 9 hours they spent in davening. Continues the Mishnah. Chassidim Hashem Hashem Sha'ar Zaflan K'nei Shechavim Lahem Mishra Shemayim. Feeling Mashal B'Shlem Mai. Lo Yashivenu. Feeling Nach Shkar Lakeva. Lo Yafsek. Even if a king is asking how you're doing, remember this is not too much Shema where you have a tear for being a prokim, be'emtza parak, etc. This is a situation of Shema Esrei. You're supposed to never be mafsek. If a melech is asking how you're doing, that you have to respond. The feel Nach Shkar Lakeva Lo Yafsek. And even if a snake is twirling himself around you, you're not to be mafsek. Is this? I feel about Shah B'Shlomo. This is going about the Chasidim Harishonim, but this is a separate halacha that a person is not able to be mafsek even if he has a Nachash Karach Al Kevai or a Melech who's being Shayal B'Shlomo. That is not so clear from the Mishnah. It sounds like maybe it's a different din because of the fact that it's written in the single rather than the Chasidim Harishonim, which is written in the plural. Fine. Continues the Gemara. How do you know that when it comes to davening, you have the davening nefesh? The pasuk says that Chana was very bitter, so it sounds like she had a lot of kavod rosh. She was in a lot of pain. We're going to see later on in Lamed Aleph all of the things that we learned from Chala. The Gemara is going to tell us is Kam Hilsa Gevirta Ikul Mishma Behind Kroy the Chana. We learned a lot of big halachas from Chana about davening. So it says the Gemara, you can't bring any rice from Chana. You might. The Machana Shani, the Havis Mira Liba Tuva. She was very bitter. She had no children. Rapini made her life miserable. So therefore, she was very bitter. That's why she had covered rush. But maybe for a regular person who's a happy person, that wouldn't be covered rush. Maybe we can learn a pasuk out from Tehillim. The David says that with the right chesed of the Rebbe, I'm coming to your house. I'm going to bow down. With fear. So you see that's covered as your mind. It says the Gemara, you have a raya from the double double trying to have a mitzvah nafshim barachim tuva. Hey, no, that's a good raya. Maybe David Amelch also has a situation where he has too much covered rush, he has too much pain, and he needs a lot of rachmi shemayim. So maybe that's again not a good raya to us regular folks. Elam Reb Shimon Levi, I have another pasuk. Ishtach l'Hashem mahadras kodesh. I'll take a mahadras al b'char rodas. Don't read the word mahadras, read it charadas. Charadas is meaning you should bow down to the Rebbeinu Shalom, not mahadras because not all good looking, but rather b'charadas with a lot of fear and trembling. That would be the kavod rosh. Says the Gemara, how do you know you want to make such a drush instead of reading mahadras to read b'charadas, which is of course not the simple reading. Maybe it literally means that you're supposed to be davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'hadras kodesh. Right, Yehuda would put on nice clothing and then he would daven. El Amram Nachman Yitzchak Rav Nachman has a different source. What's the Yitzchak source? Imdu es Hashem b'yira v'gilu b'ra'ada. You should serve Hashem with fear, and you should rejoice with Him with trembling. So, my v'gilu b'ra'ada. What does it mean? Amar Rav Ada bar Ada bar Mas Amar Rabba v'vakim gilu shamtei ra'ada. What does it mean? Imdu es Hashem b'yira v'gilu b'ra'ada. Wherever you have gil, wherever you have serious fun, there's you also have ra'ad. You should also have fear. You should also have kavod rosh. Abai Avi Yosef came the Rabba. Abai was sitting in front of Rabba Chazda. He saw that he was too jocular. He was too happy. So he challenged his Rebbe. He says, "But aren't you supposed to be rejoicing to Hashem with fear?" Siv doesn't say that. So I know tefillin. Says I'm wearing tefillin. Since I'm wearing tefillin, they are an edus that I am going to be having the requisite amount of fear of heaven, and therefore you don't have to worry about me. Rabbi Yomi Avigas came to Rav Zera, similar situation. He was sitting in front of his Rabbi Zera, so he was very happy. He says also you should be maybe a little bit more restrained. He says I'm wearing tefillin, don't worry about me. So I think we're gonna have to stop over here. Yeah, so we'll stop here on Lamed Amud Beis. We'll do Lamed Amud Aleph in a few minutes. Have a wonderful day.